this piece. This holds it all in place. It's got the gear on the top of it, that couples the cocking rack to the film advance. So I need to force some grease into that. Check that that runs smoothly. That seems fine. This sits on the top here. Now the little arm on this bracket holds this thing down, stops it from rising up too far. There are 3 screws hold that bracket down. One of them in this case was the wrong screw, but I've found a replacement. Now how they came to do that, I'm not too oh, I know why. The screw's stripped in the housing. So that's why they'd had the wrong screw there. They've stripped out the proper screw. Okay. That explains things. Right. So that hole's been stripped out and they put a larger screw in there. Okay, well it looks like we'll be putting a larger screw in there too then. Right. So I'm looking for a foreigner now. A screw that doesn't belong, which will fill that thing up. Was it that one? Yes, it was. Okay, so that's the answer there. Now we know why there was a foreigner there, why there was a screw that shouldn't have been there. It's because somebody'd stripped out the screw that should have been there. That's interesting. That's the first time I've seen that happen in that particular place. It's a little bit difficult to know how someone came to do that. I suppose the simplest explanation would be that someone had cross-threaded a screw and driven it down all the way, and that stripped the thread out of the housing. So I'm being a bit suspicious now. We're being very cautious about these screws, what might have been used, and if somebody's butchered one of the screws, have they butchered more than one of the screws? Okay, then we need to get this spring down in place. Lift that over the back of that arm. That seems to be right. Oh, the interesting things you find in old cameras. Of course, that could have been done at any time in the last 70 years. And whoever was guilty of that, they may have been pushing up daisies for decades. Right, let's get the bit of grease on here. Don't need to go overboard because that'll transfer around quite nicely. That would be the start position. I need to come around a full turn from there to get some tension. That would be the start position for my lever. If we press that, swing this, yeah, that is fairly adequate return tension. That feels quite good. From that point I can put the cocking rack in place. So I'll apply a little bit of synthetic grease to that. Feed that in there. Now as this swings round to the end of its stroke, I'll take it you heard that pop up. I'll take it a little bit further and I can engage this rack. And I'm looking to see where it sits at the rest position there. It sits, there's about 2 millimeters of it sticking out, maybe 3, that's about ideal. That's at the start position with this held back against there. So that's working nicely. Normally I just leave this parked in that position because it keeps everything in place. This pawl is holding that in place and that'll just sit there while I deal with the next stuff I want to deal with. Okay, so what I want to do here, now we know that the frame counter spring is broken, so the frame counter will not work. So it means, of course, that the end of frame catch won't work either. That's okay, that's not the end of the world with a Retina IIa. It's a minor nuisance. I'll put the film advance on here, the lever, and all the bits and pieces. And get that part, check that it all moves smoothly. So I'll put a bit of grease under this. The remains of this frame counter spring, that must go in place. It's essential that that's there. You can't just throw it out. Nothing will work if you just throw that out. It's got to be there, even though the little tip which will move the counter isn't. Get these other bits together now. These parts, I'll glue them together with a bit of grease, because if you didn't do that, they'd all be falling apart and it just gets chaotic. So put a bit of grease between those two, and I put a bit of grease on the bottom of the number dial too for the same reason. Now this chrome ring here is, in almost every case except the one I'm holding in my hand, has a scratch across it pointing to where the number 1 should be. I can see a very small scratch pointing in that direction. That is it. But normally there's a fairly pronounced scratch across that. It's been put in with a sharp tool, been put in by hand, and it just looks like a little random piece of ugliness. But it did have a purpose. It was to tell the assembler that's the direction that the number 1 needed to go. Otherwise you end up with a film advance that locks at frame 21 or whatever it happens to be. Put the top piece on and put some synthetic grease on this wavy washer. And holding that together as a unit, get that on the top of the film advance, rotate that clockwise. You can hear that clicking in, that's good. There's a little star washer goes on the top, and then the screw. Can you see any of that? Only just. You see my fat finger, that's about all you can see. Okay. And that shutter release is not releasing. That suggests that that square on the top there is not right. Let me have a look at this. We need to get that back in, of course. Yeah, it certainly doesn't want to release. I can't depress the shutter release, and I can't repress the shutter release because this piece is around too far this way. Yeah, I've got that sitting in the wrong position. Okay, let's have this off, do this right. Something is not assembled correctly there. I can't have been holding my mouth right. There's our start position. There's where the lever needs to start its motion. That's out at 90 degrees. Let's get the rack back in place. Needs to go in at least one more notch. Oh, it doesn't want to. That's it. Let's try that. That looks correct. Okay, that's working normally. So I had something out of whack there. It was round from where it should be. This needs to come around far enough that this clears that bracket and allows this to pop up. And it doesn't quite get there. That's due to that twist in the shaft that I was mentioning earlier. I'm just watching the action. Oh look, it just gets there and no more. There's definitely just enough backlash in this mechanism that it'll go from working nicely to not working at all. And it'll do it when your back's turned. So that shaft is still a problem. I'm going to have to put a twist in that shaft in order to get it to the stage where the lever will swing round to its hard stop. But it'll also have carried this far forward enough. So in other words, I've got to take the top of the shaft and twist it clockwise, even further than I had previously. Right, have it apart again then. So, okay, so what I've got to do is strip this off, take the shaft out, put a twist in it, put it back together. Well, that little bit of bush surgery sorted that out. And now we have a film advance that works reliably and as designed, even though the parts do not look like quite like the shape they used to be. That's okay. So we've got a film advance that works. Of course, we don't have a frame counter that works, and we won't do, because the frame counter spring is broken, and replacement frame counter springs are not to be had. But at least I haven't seen any available in a long time. They used to show up. Who used to have them? Micro Tools. Kurt Fargo's Micro Tools used to have aftermarket ones. Last time I saw them, I think they were about $70 US, so I might be wrong. But I haven't seen them there for a long time. So the film advance is going and it works nicely. The camera body is otherwise good. Opens and closes. Focus is nice and smooth. So apart from cleaning up the top housing, cleaning up the rangefinder, adjusting it and fitting that back, I've got to glue back this leather on the base of the camera, which I think I can do now. Now I could have got over enthusiastic early in the piece and put that leather back immediately, but of course I've had it apart twice since then already, so it's just lucky that I wasn't over enthusiastic about that. So I'm gluing this leather back now, I think, because I'm confident I'm not going to need to get back in there again. Right, I'll glue this leather back down. This camera's only lightly cursed, I think we'll get on top of it. So I'll apply some glue to this piece of paper and transfer it in with a toothpick, I think. To make sure I get plenty of cover on the edges, because it's the edges of leatherettes or leather that the leatherette will peel from. It doesn't peel from the middle. This leather is quite absorbent, so it's sucking up the adhesive. In fact, it's sucking it up quite a lot, so I thought I'd been very generous with the amount I've put out on the paper, but obviously not. So what I want is a nice even film of adhesive. This is leather we're dealing with, not leatherette, and leather is much more forgiving. It doesn't go all melty from the solvent. It stays looking like leather. So the fact that there's a little bit of spill onto the surface is of no consequence at all. It'll just rub off. That leather's lying down nice and flat. I don't think there'll be any sign at all that anyone was ever in there. And I'll put those two screws back in the tripod sockets around, and that'll be the base of the camera dealt with. Because I'm full of confidence that even though I've had to open it up twice to have a go at that film advance, I'm never going to have to do that again. That moves lovely. That's just like I bought one. Okay, that's the camera body. I'll clean the top cover next and then deal with that rangefinder. This top cover, as you can see, there's no screw heads visible on that accessory shoe. This was done by Kodak for a brief time. Someone came up with the marvellous idea that it would be easier to put the serial numbers on the accessory shoe rather than having to handle and engrave the top cover each time, because the fewer times you need to handle the top cover, the less opportunity there is to damage it, and you would end up with serial numbers not being used because the top cover had been somehow scuffed or damaged or bent. So handling the accessory shoe and putting the serial number on there seemed like a bright idea. Of course, if you had the accessory shoe fixed from the outside in the normal fashion, anyone could change the serial number simply by unscrewing it. So some bright spark came up with the idea that we will put the screws on the inside. And to put the screws on the inside, they are very small screws. And what happens with the very small screws is typically, with the normal stresses of sliding things in and out of the accessory shoe, they get stressed, and once they've been stressed they become loose. And of course when they become loose there's no way to tighten them up because they're fitted from the inside. And what happens then is that they fall out. So if the screws fall out, either one at a time or one after each other over a period of time, they're going to end up somewhere. Now you may be very lucky. They may find their way out through this hole here and escape into the wild and cause no problems. But what regrettably happens fairly frequently is that the screws rattle about inside the top of the camera until they can find their way down into the film advance mechanism here. And being nice and small, they fit neatly between the gears at the top of the sprocket shaft and the gear that drives it. So what happens is you are busily swinging the advance lever and everything's going nicely, and all of a sudden it jams, and there's no obvious reason why. And of course a lot of people, they want to clear the blockage, so they swing a little bit harder and they clear the blockage all right, but they shear a tooth off the typically they shear a tooth off the top of the sprocket shaft, and then you end up in a situation like one of my customers contacted me recently, where when he winds the film, instead of the sprocket shaft here taking off, it just sits there idly. But if you move it a couple of notches forward manually, it picks up on the next stroke and moves until it hits the bald patch where there's no tooth on the top of the gear, and then it stops revolving again. So that's what happens. All as a consequence of some bright spark deciding it would be handier to put the serial numbers on the accessory shoe than anywhere else. Of course, the other aspect of that is that you often find old cameras, Retina IIas and IIas, where the shoe's lost. And because the shoe's lost, the serial number's lost. And you either find them with another shoe fitted that's got a completely different serial number, or a shoe that's come off a camera where the screws went in from the outside, and so someone has tapped the holes into the top cover to fit one of those shoes instead. And of course at that stage there's no serial number, because those cameras that had the screws on the outside had their serial number here on the top cover, and ones that never had that never did. So there you go, that's the secrets of screws holding the accessory shoes in place. Now how do you make that less of a problem? Well, what I always do is lock these three screws with some lacquer so that they are less likely to rattle loose, and so as a consequence less likely to fall in anywhere and cause things to break. Of course I've got to take this off now because I want to clean this top cover. There's usually a fair amount of scunge underneath that accessory shoe, and that'll just be condensation, finger grease, the usual filth that you find in things. But of course it can't be wiped away because it's underneath something, so it builds up, and what you tend to get is a build up of scunge under there, and then you end up with corrosion all around the outside edge where dust and other rubbish has collected and absorbed moisture, and that just acts like a lovely little sponge to keep a bit of moisture there and promote corrosion. So you usually end up with a ring of corrosion around there. Okay, so I've just removed the frame there that was holding the glass in place. The glass looked relatively clean, but looking at it now I can see that it's certainly in need of a clean. And I've got to clean the eyepiece of course too. So I'll clean this cover with naphtha, and I'll clean that eyepiece glass there with glass cleaner on a cotton bud inside and out, and the two windows to go back in the front, and reassemble everything. Well, here's the top all cleaned up. Glass is nice and sparkly, all been cleaned inside and out. As you can see, I've put a touch of lacquer on those 3 screw heads there. That'll prevent them from rattling loose at any time in the future. They'll come loose if anyone wants them to come loose, but they won't just rattle out of their own all by themselves. So that's the top cover done, and I'll need to turn my attention to the rangefinder. But I'm running out of daylight here, so perhaps tomorrow.